A Confederacy of Dunces is unique because it really combines these two types of characters. On the one hand, you have the stereotyped minor characters, and then you have this bizarre, quirky Ignatius, who just says a lot of weird things by way of irrelevant digressions. And nearly everything he says is just a non sequitur. And the style of his digressions actually has its roots in the early 18th century book by Jonathan Swift, The Tale of a Tub. So, if you like dunces and you think it's funny, check out The Tale of a Tub. But actually, to engage in a bit of speculation, I actually wonder if the reason why some people don't think this book is funny is because Ignatius just says a lot of weird stuff. And maybe the type of people who don't like this book just don't like quirkiness generally and just appreciate type of comedy more of the historical type that just where the moral characters offset the superficial bad comic characters. I don't know. That's just speculation. But so we've talked about comedy at the level of character type. But why do we actually laugh at the things in this book? What are the mechanisms of laughter? So I touched on a few things already. Absent-mindedness, Bergson talks about absent-mindedness, right? And then there's repetition, just repetitively describing the same things over and over, just making the character seem like a robot is always funny. Though that technique is probably more suited to stock characters than quirky comic characters, where humor is more based on just irrelevance and random non sequiturs, like I said. Although Ignatius actually himself harps on things repetitively too, but it's more, he says the same things over and over, a lot of the same things just at random inappropriate moments. So Ignatius really combines the multiple techniques. So there are other techniques we could talk about, but instead let's talk about two dominant explanations for laughter. Okay, two dominant explanations. Why do we laugh? So one of the things that are most often noted about this book is the way John Kennedy Toole captures the culture of New Orleans and the mix of its population. And the way he most does this is through speech patterns. Every character has their own idiosyncratic speech patterns. And a lot of them have just variants of New Orleans dialect. And some have a very heavy dialect, and then there's kind of a gradation where some have the lighter dialect, and there's some characters who just occasionally speak ungrammatical. And then there's Ignatius, or maybe Ignatius is at the top. Ignatius and his girlfriend have very highly sophisticated speech patterns. And so when the heavy dialects, or the characters with heavy dialects, are confronted with Ignatius' own highly sophisticated speech, the characters often get confused, and it's very funny. But the point of saying that is that Thomas Hobbes once said that and this is a book called Human Nature. He wrote this book, Human Nature, published in 1650, and he wrote that laughter is nothing else but a sudden glory arising from some sudden conception of some eminency in ourselves, by comparison with the infirmity of others, or with our own formerly. And so, what is he talking about? Well, in other words, we just laugh because we feel superior to people. And so earlier I railed against the type of reader who does nothing more than seek to relate the character to himself. And when I said that, I was directing my criticism against those who don't like the book. But that could just as easily be said about the people who do. If we keep Hobbes in mind, there's probably some people who like this book, mostly or primarily, at least in partly, because they just liken themselves to Ignatius. They think they are him. They like to imagine that they are him. And they are just kind of pompous types. They have a big vocabulary, and they think that they're just superior to others. And that's why they think it's funny that Ignatius is always insulting people. He believes inferior to him in a style of speech that the other characters don't understand. But that's just a bit of speculation. So he has this elegant way of speaking. But then there's the fact that he is also just this Falstaffian figure of monstrous activity. He's constantly belching. He's gorging himself on food and drink. He's farting. He's masturbating. He's offending those around him with his just horrendous smell. So he says certain things and he does others. right? Now, Francis Hutcheson was another philosopher who thought about humor. And Francis Hutcheson lived in the 18th century. He lived after Hobbes. And he was responding to Hobbes. And he has this to say. The jest is increased by the dignity, gravity, or modesty of the person, which shows that it is this contrast or opposition of ideas of dignity and meanness which is the occasion of laughter. So, no, actually, I took this quote. This quote is taken out of context. He's talking here, he's having a discussion about great men on the toilet. He's talking about great men on the toilet here. So what's humor about according to Hutcheson? According to Hutcheson, it's really incongruity. The incongruity of the high and the low. So in Ignatius' case, it's about the incongruity between his quixotic ideas on the one hand and his idea of speaking about them and his just totally obscene behavior. Now, who doesn't think that's funny? I mean, really. But this incongruity, actually, it goes deeper than this. It actually reflects a deeper incongruity of his own worldview, of Ignatius' two separate worldviews. So we've already talked about William Langland, Piers Plowman, and Boethius' Consolation of Philosophy. There's the lofty worldview, the lofty medieval worldview inherent in those books. But there's another medieval worldview, and that's the worldview of the marketplace, the carnivalesque. Ignatius J. Riley is this grotesque spectacle. He's a man of folly and vice. He's a buffoonish clown. If New Orleans is the feast of fools, then he is the king. He is a figure of perpetual Mardi Gras. So, while his ideals are very uncarnivalesque, he's always condemning filth and degeneracy. He's always, he's always saying all these things, but he turns out to be his own biggest example of that which he hates, and he doesn't even realize it. So we're back to the notion of absent-mindedness that Bergson talks about. His absent-mindedness of his own incongruity. So as Bergson says here, let's quote Bergson again, briefly. It is not uncommon for a comic character to condemn in general terms a certain line of conduct and immediately afterwards afford an example of it himself. So what? So the real and the ideal exist alongside one another, or the real of the novel. But despite his flaws, Ignatius is really a figure of transcendence. The marketplace he finds himself in is a very sad one. You have a factory with poor conditions. You have a pathetic strip joint inhabited by degenerates. You have an inept policewoman on the verge of being fired. And then there's Ignatius' own poverty, the alcoholism of his mother, his single mother, I might add, and Ignatius brings a certain festivity into this world that wouldn't be there without him. So Ignatius, while maybe not a realistic character, not even a likable character, is not a simple one. He is complex. He is a creature of paradox and a very funny one. And once we understand all of this, I think we can even empathize with him. Or at least we can empathize with him after we've laughed at him and we're reflecting on why we're laughing. So that's it. That's Confederacy of Dunces in a nutshell, within reason. Okay? So, thank you for watching.